Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Cron. I am Terentia's community manager. I'm thrilled to be hosting our now second webinar in our first series of community conversations for Terentia. In our first webinar, AI for Museums, Building a Foundation, we explored how AI is being used in museums for collections management, audience engagement, and operational efficiency. If you missed it, the recording is available on our website and YouTube channel. Now, for today, we will have a series of open discussions on AI policymaking, data privacy and security, cultural sensitivity, the role of museums, and how how they play that role as a source of truth, and ethical AI implementation. We will have a couple of polls for attendees to respond to, so please put any questions that you have throughout the webinar, as well in the Q&A chat, or sorry, in the Q&A section, and feel free to participate in the discussion in the chat. Next slide, Lauren. Now, for those who are new to us, Terentia is a next generation platform designed to meet the unique digital asset and collections management needs of museums, libraries, archives, and other cultural heritage institutions. This webinar series represents Terentia's ongoing technology and educational mission to bring collections management and DAM out of the basement, break down the traditional silos between the systems, and make managing and sharing your collections information easier and more impactful. Before we get started today, I would like to make a quick introduction of our speakers. I'm going to start with Catherine Devine, who is a retired technology leader, is the former director of libraries and museum strategy at Microsoft. At Microsoft, she developed global strategies and authored the Microsoft Libraries and Museums Digital Transformation Framework, guiding cultural institutions through the digital era. Next, we have Nick Honeysett, who's the CEO of Balboa Park Online Collaborative, a nonprofit consultancy offering digital strategy and IT services to the cultural sector. Nick frequently speaks on digital transformation and digital strategy as well. Last and certainly not least is Neal, CEO of Terentia and founder of Cremata Solutions, who has over 20 years of experience in digital asset management. He's known for aligning technology solutions with strategic goals. Neal is passionate about empowering cultural institutions through DAM innovations and fostering community-driven knowledge sharing in the GLAM sector. Now, before we dive into our discussion on AI policymaking, we would like to start with a couple of polls to get us going. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. So does your museum have an AI policy? And once everyone's had a chance to respond, we'll go ahead and share the results and we'll talk a bit more about that. Right.
Also, if anybody wants to add anything about their AI policies or anything, feel free to use the chat and don't forget to throw those questions on.
Yes, for all of our polls today, I will send or share a reminder if the responses don't apply to you, or if you feel you'd like to add more, please contribute that to the chat.
We should have guessed what the results are going to be.
I know. I was just thinking that.
I wonder if it's going to confirm what, kind of anecdotally what we're seeing.
Yeah. Should have had another one that was here's a whole bunch of our bets on it.
Yeah.
The poll.
These
Our poll
are
of the
still
poll.
responding, so I'll give it a few more minutes or a few more seconds.
I can't remember the last time. Did we see them as they were coming in? This time I don't see.
No, we just see them at the end.
Yeah. Oh, it was at the end.
I'm going to say I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that one too.
I'm going to
I can't wait until you guys
I'm
see
going to
these
say
results.
no. I'm going to say no is the predominant answer.
We'll
All right.
see.
I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share those results.
55.
A win.
Yeah, it wasn't a win.
Yeah.
But I'm really encouraged by 24% being in development. That's great.
That is good. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and that people know that it's in development, right? I think I was going for I'm not sure because communication might be not forthcoming.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things I think is going to be a 2025 initiative that everybody's going to have to be thinking about as with our policies, and a great time to start asking about, especially if you're experimenting with stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. There was an
All right.
interesting comment about this, actually, if you don't mind, Alex, just if
Yeah,
you don't
go
mind, McKenna, I believe it is. It was only to us, but it was about being a presidential site, and their AI policy, we were wanting to say something about not endorsing chatbots using the president's likeness. Oh, that's very interesting.
Oh, that is
So things
interesting.
to think about. Yeah, for sure.
All
All
right.
right.
I'm going to go ahead and stop.
Oh, sorry. Somebody said, I wish your poll gave the number of responses. So it's actually, do you have that, Alex?
I
Yeah,
do,
it says
yes.
that.
So we had
It said it, yeah.
114.
Yeah.
We had
100
114 responses.
And 63 were no, right?
Right.
Yes,
63
63 of
now.
those 114 were no.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And only
Right.
8 yes. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a really interesting one. All right.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to go ahead and launch our next poll.
Wow, that was a really good comment
How
there
is your
about,
museum's AI use communicated to staff? All right. And again, if none of these responses apply to you and your organization, please feel free to, put your own response in the chat.
while you're doing that, there's a really great comment about a museum inside a university. So the university has AI policies, which I'm not surprised about, but then how does it get tailored? That's a really interesting one.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, that's Francis at Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Francis.
All right. What do we think on this one, Nick? I think there has been little communication about AI.
I think a little, yeah.
I'm not going to give it away. I want it to
That's
be
okay.
fun.
Don't do it, Alex.
Oh, can you see it as it's going? You probably can.
I can, yeah.
Alex can, but we can't. Yeah.
Right.
What would you say if you were like one where maybe it is being used, but you weren't really told it's being used because like you're using something like Copilot on Teams, but you just don't realize that it's AI is something interesting.
Oh, yeah.
That is a good
Right.
point. Yeah.
Or even things like Grammarly could be, part of your world. Or Otter, Otter.ai, so it's in the name. It's a little bit differently, but a common notes taker.
It is interesting. So a couple of university museums coming under the broader university policy.
Yeah.
We should talk about that, about if there's any,
Yes.
not necessarily
Okay.
conflict, but issues around that.
Okay, so it looks like our responses coming in have slowed down. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share those results.
John Moore.
right.
Yes,
Now discuss.
we were right.
You were.
Almost half.
Wow.
Alex, maybe we should give the headlines for people who have disabilities in reading this.
Oh, sorry. Headlines.
But yeah, so
results.
47% were little or no
Oh,
communication.
yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. So out of
sorry.
108 responses, the most picked response was there has been little or no communication about AI with staff. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah. And interestingly, only 2 have a formal plan. Yeah.
That's
Next
lucky.
most
That's why we're
select-
here.
The next most select response was AI use is discussed in team meetings and or through informal updates.
Yeah, I would have thought that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
7 provide training. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good to see.
Absolutely. All
Okay.
right. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Thank you, everyone, for participating in those polls. We will have a couple more later in the webinar. So as museums increasingly adopt AI into day-to-day operations, the need for thoughtful AI policy making becomes essential. AI policy making in this context refers to, creating frameworks and guidelines that govern how AI is used to support and protect your museum's mission, ensuring alignment with ethical, legal, and cultural values. Nick, can you start us off by talking about how AI policy making creates new opportunities for museums?
Well, maybe start off more broadly around just creating a policy. So we just seen a result that says, there is a lack of policy. And I think this is typical in museums where, technology happens, stuff starts and museums, struggle to keep up. And I think, it reminds me, I think there's a parallel between this and social media. You remember when social media first came up, it was a while before policies actually started coming in, because I think I'm interpreting it right now. I don't think leadership kind of understood what social media was when it first came out. So we had, this kind of a slew of policies around do's and don'ts for social media. And I think maybe that educated museums more broadly about creating policies around technology, but it seems like we're still kind of on the back foot on this. And so I think a couple of things to say, one is, a lot of this is about sharing data. And the big concerns are about, well, I'm going to put some data in this thing that is open and accessible to all. So there are some kind of privacy stuff around that. So we'll talk about we'll talk about that. But really, museums should have these more broad policies and guidelines around the use of their intellectual property and how they, interact with the world. And a lot of this actually should be in a more kind of all-encompassing policy around it. But as we've seen from the results, I think there's a couple of things. We certainly recommend two aspects to this. One is, what do you communicate to staff? And I think we saw some significant results in the polls about just understanding, well, what is it? And I think, that's an email. It's a short email covering, maybe half a dozen different aspects. It's, be true to your museum. So, most museums have policies around, upholding your institution's values and missions. Obviously, protecting confidential information and IP. I think most staff understand the difference between information that they have that is kind of proprietary or personal, so particularly around constituent data, but then also there's sensitive information around collections, around donors, development, all that kind of stuff. Verifying the outputs, right? We are, if there is a broad philosophy around the incoming, the impact of AI, it's that we will be using it to help us in our work. So broadly speaking, we will be less creative. I know that may be alarming, but we will be more evaluative, right? And we talked, if you were on this session, the webinar last week, we talked about this kind of AI-informed notion where you're using AI to give you information about stuff and you are evaluating it. So you're not initiating that, you're evaluating it. I think that's a broad strategy that we'll see. A lot of issues around image recognition. We've certainly seen the headlines around problematic creation of images and identification of images. So that should certainly be communicated. And then I think, as with anything, be transparent that you are using AI. I think, certainly you see instances in collections interpretation and presentation of, particularly now over the last couple of years, about an open comment about, this interpretation was done at a time when, we weren't so sensitive to cultural bias and cultural challenges there. And I think that's the same thing with AI. If you're using it, you should say you're using it and be transparent about it. And report concerns. Next slide, Lauren. And then I think there's a more kind of robust and comprehensive, here is our formal document, a little bit like an HR handbook, a staff handbook. You've got a difference about, here's a communication that really just kind of gives you the broad guidelines, but then here is the details around this. And I think there's at least, well, there's more categories for this. It's about being ethical, ensuring transparency. We know there's a lot of issues around cultural sensitivity and bias. It's about compliance. If you have sensitive data, private data, be sensitive around that. Coming up with guidelines about implementation and how you can and cannot use it. I think there was a comment about, we're developing a policy which is about what not to do. That's a great example. Training, we had 7 institutions responding that they're doing training. That is great. I think being literate and understand what's going on here should be part of the guidelines. managing the risk, the collaboration, certainly don't do this in a silo, either formal or informal collaboration around using AI certainly should be encouraged. Maintenance, AI is a rapidly evolving and moving technology that we are, all of us, trying to keep up with. And so ensuring that you are regularly reviewing what's going on and have this feedback loop about usage and awareness about how it's being used across the institution. And then accountability, if it makes a mistake, it's one reason for actually, stating that you are using AI, because if it does come up with something that is problematic, you at least have that backstop of, well, we used it, we understand it, it hallucinates, it creates bias results. And so to some degree, you are covered about that. But clear guidelines about its usage are probably important. So that's kind of an oversight. So two options: one, simple communication to staff, at least that it's being developed, to address some of those findings in the poll. But then a much more detailed, here is much more specifics around what we think we should be doing.
Thanks, Nick. I'd love to hear from Catherine and Neal as well.
Yeah, I think I would be absolutely encouraging an AI policy, even if the view is that you don't know everything there is to know yet. There are some things that are known now, and I think having a policy that evolves and becomes a so-called living document as we learn more about the technology and where its opportunities and where its risks are, I think is something we should highly encourage. So it's a long way of saying, don't pursue perfection in the interests of having something, because without it, we're opening our organizations up to a lot of risk without actually being aware that we are.
Yeah, and to add to that, Catherine, I think one of the big things is we tend to set policies and then we leave them for years. And I think with AI's advancements happening so quickly right now, AI is probably one of those ones that you want to experiment with and adjust your policies every 3 months, maybe, or every 6 months as things come up. So as somebody has pointed out, I'm sorry, I'll just go back. I think Jock mentioned it, but some others, about having a different policy for generative AI versus your use of AI for creating catalogs versus creating imagery or using it, something like that, along those ways. I think those are completely different, and you may need different policies for all of those. Or somebody said, we're not going to, at the initial part, not using or allowing chatbots to pretend that they are a US president is a really good example of some policies that you can set out front and then start to move away to things that you should do with it.
Yeah, agree. Can I just add to that, I think we shouldn't just view policy as being all about the negative either, right? A balanced policy. There are plenty of opportunities here as well as risks. So just something to think about, where it could be an opportunity for your organization to make it a policy. It could create efficiency. It could create more engagement. I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities. So just something to think about. And also to remember, this is an early technology. You're only just starting to see the first instantiations of it. So
absolutely.
I think that's right. And we tend to do that in the museum world, is, well, this is what it is and this is how it's going to be. And I think, we often see, museums often approach things as a project, right? As a beginning, middle, and end, kind of like an exhibition, as opposed to, this is an ongoing thing that is going to evolve, and we need to be aware of it. And for me, I think the most crucial thing is literacy, so training and collaboration within an institution, right? You've got to bring it out so people do understand how it can be used and what the pitfalls might be, so that they can head them off.
Right. Any final thoughts before we move on to the next topic?
I'm just going to add one more, because I've always got a thought. I liken this to some of marketing, So in the early days of digital marketing, you could send an email to anybody about anything and they could never opt out, right? But as time evolved, policies came in place and eventually rules, I think, as well, that, required you to be able to unsubscribe, for example, or allowed you to opt out, or maybe it defaulted to opt out. And I think we'll see the same thing. Some of the guidelines are not in place yet, but they will become. But that doesn't stop us from having a policy now about where we see opportunity and risk.
Absolutely. Now, while your museum thinks about its policies on AI, data privacy and security are critical factors to consider. Before we open up for discussion on that, we would love to hear how does your museum consider its AI data privacy? And I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll for that one as well. I can't wait to see the responses for this. Any bets?
I think it's probably somewhere between the data privacy is a concern, we haven't formally addressed it, or we haven't. I think, museums have addressed data in general, but as it relates to how does it add into the AI component, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think people recognize it's a concern,
Right.
but may not have every.
But, as I said earlier, there should be, your institution should have data privacy guidelines
Yes.
and policies. I mean, whether you're aware of them or not, it must have.
GDPR or California standards.
Right,
like there's
California.
enough of
I mean,
those.
there's a bunch, Texas. I mean,
Yeah.
a bunch of states have, it's somewhat easier in Europe because it's kind of blanket GDPR as opposed to over here, it's kind of a state by state. So where does the responsibility lie? Is it from the originator or the consumer?
Mhm.
And again, if none of these responses in the poll apply to you, your organization, please feel free to, share your response in the chat. It does look like our incoming responses have slowed down. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share those results.
That's an interesting, right. Oh, look at that. Nailed it.
But
so
yeah,
out of 95 responses, the top response was data privacy is a concern, but we haven't formally addressed it yet. Followed by we haven't considered data privacy in relation to AI implementation.
But I am extremely, extremely happy to see we have 13 people saying that they have some great policies or thinking about AI initiatives, and the other one 15 that are there. Those are really great, and even that assessments are going on. And bear in mind, maybe not everybody's in the IT world or part of all of this and aren't sure. And I think that's part of the education, but this is really great.
Absolutely. And we have some great questions coming in from the chat that we can
And
address
comments,
during
right.
the open
Yeah.
discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing those poll results.
Right. Well, thank you, Alex, for all of this. I think this is a big one on keeping your museum and visitor data safe, jumping into this one and how AI is using your sensitive information. I'm going to illustrate this by talking about two things that are very easy for everybody to understand. One is thinking about your data when it comes to collections management, and then a second one with visitor experiences. I think those are ones that are really easy to utilize with this. So if you think about a user experience on personalized recommendations, or thinking about visitor flow and being able to track people along the way. When we think about those things, and then think about a collection record and all of the detailed information that's on the collection record that could be there, the art, not only just the artist's information, but you could also have things like their address or their date of birth. And in some cases, we've even seen documents that could have somebody's SIN number on it for those examples of what we're talking about here. So thinking about the information that you're collecting or the information you're trying to get from people, we need to then think about that visitor data and the data collection, just like we do our website. So if you think about how we're on our website, we have policy that says we're using this for Google Analytics, we're using this to track, X, Y, or Z. I think it's going to become our responsibility to let people know that inside of the museum, we do have a visitor flow that is tracking them and that is potentially doing, biometric identification who they are. We hear this all the time in a dam capacity, where what they want to do is be able to do facial recognition on the board members or on a big donor that comes in and check it. But is that part of your policy that allows for that to occur is one of those questions that you have to ask yourself. And then additionally, where is that data going with the organizations that you're using, whether in your dams, your collections, or your separate AI systems? Where does that data go? Think about it as well from your visitor data and event photos, right? We all have that placard when we have an event that says, if you attend the event, you give us the right to take your photo, right, for use in media, et cetera, et cetera. Does it need to start to extend to also say that we may then identify you and use AI to identify other pictures you're in, and then therefore we've captured that even more? Because the reason why this is important is because then when you're sharing this data with these AI systems, where does it go from there? A good friend of ours, Jacques from the Nasher, sent us a really interesting podcast that he used to summarize last week's session, which I love. Jacques, it was really cool. So it was like a 20-minute podcast that talked about our webinar, but also he recognized and pointed out YouTube as a really good example. So all of us are uploading videos to YouTube. Are you aware now that you can select what AI the video will also contribute to those learning models? So it's automatically going to YouTube and therefore automatically being added to Gemini. But then you could also say, I'd like this to be added into the Microsoft or added into one of, I think there was like 20 or 30 that were on the list. And that's why it's so important that you understand what you can do with the data and be transparent and ask the right questions of your suppliers of this technology, whether that be directly as in I'm buying some sort of AI experience from chooseanyname.ai company, or from a collections management or a digital asset management system or anything that is also using third-party AI in it. We should be aware of that. The second part about this is thinking about that data from collection or visitor data that you can then anonymize. So you want to be able to take some of that data and say, I want to give it this information about all of these objects in order to create maybe sample descriptions or anything like that. But we actually want to hold back from the AI machine or learning model this information that we consider sensitive or data that they shouldn't be able to use at all. And then how do you anonymize or mask that information? I'm sure there's a lot of IT people on as well. And so some of the things for those who are non-IT to be thinking about with it is how is the transfer of data happening? I think, is the data encrypted, not just in transit, but at rest? Where is the data going? Really, you should be asking your suppliers where the data centers are. You should know where that data goes. It's sometimes shocking to find out that a company, even in the US or Canada, could be actually putting that data somewhere in Europe or in Asia. But if you don't ask that question, you're not really sure and who has access to this information when it comes to some of those things like security question and where is it going. So thinking about things like how can you make sure that your data is aligned with maybe keeping your data sovereign in your country, or where does it go, or these are the questions that you need to be asking for or asking your vendors in order to keep it safe. The last one I want to bring up is starting to learn some of the terms and conditions inside of AI terms and conditions. I mean, let's be fair. A lot of us never really read terms and conditions when we download things or we use our phone or anything. There's a great YouTube video, by the way, if anybody ever wants to see it, where there's like 3 iPads and then you sign the terms and conditions and then they come and they bring you like 10 dogs. And you're like, what do you mean? I just wanted an iPad. And they're like, well, you signed up to take these 10 dogs home and take care of them. They're your dogs now. It's like, what? I didn't. I mean, I would love 10 dogs. I'm not sure if my spouse would let me bring home 10 dogs because I got an iPad, but you see where I'm going. There is a term that I've been tracing quite a bit inside of the terms and conditions that you'll see, and you can Google this, which is calibrate data models. And that's in their terms and conditions that says, what can they do with your data? And essentially what it means is by giving them your data, they can use that to calibrate their data models. And if you Google it, you'll see it's on almost every AI company that is out there. And it's becoming this synonymous term about what is that defined as. And these are things that you should be learning about or finding out about. And then I also would encourage you to be looking at your potential vendors' websites. Do they have AI policies? Are they talking about this at all? What are they doing with it? And so companies today need to be a lot more transparent with their potential customers on where that's going. And these are the things that you can be doing today to think about how to keep things safe, which is where is your data going? And actually, before you start with some transcription service or something like that, even for your meeting transcriptions, where is it going? What is that data being used for? And is it just automatically being attached to people's learning models? I think where you're going to find out is really quickly, people are buying data. Look at the 23andMe DNA data right now. You know, the company went bankrupt, but people are all trying to buy that data because it's so important. And we don't realize how much we gave them our data without knowing it. This is not to be alarmist. It's about to be aware of, so that you're being consciously aware of what you're giving it and what you're not. The last point I'll say is keep your data safe by not applying confidential information into things like a ChatGPT model. And so there's been many times where some of the big consulting firms got in a lot of trouble because some of their staff were actually putting confidential corporate information inside of the ChatGPT model to help it rewrite or to write an email or anything like that. And then it turns out that stuff can be mined very easily. And so that was the last thing I'd say is think about what you're adding into these and be consciously aware of them, especially when they're free, like a ChatGPT model.
Thank you, Neal.
Nick,
So,
Catherine?
yeah, there's some nuance here that we should probably talk about. I don't know, Catherine, are you ready to go in?
No, go for it. Go for it.
I think so that there's, you know, ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, mostly ChatGPT, because that was really one of the first out of the gate, was really, you know, a beta system that was released on the public to test from. And they are definitely responding to these concerns. So we've seen, you know, certainly concerns about where is this information coming from, and now you'll see citations appearing in responses, particularly if you ask them. But I think that we should definitely make a distinction between using the free model or even a subscription to the ChatGPT website, Gemini, where you can actually select a temporary chat, right, which is not going to calibrate their model. So you can have an interaction where you are not uploading your information to the large language model, the information behind it. I think the other thing to be cognizant of is increasingly, as we're seeing kind of AI on the back end of systems, so collections management systems, you're seeing that appear now. Definitely seeing it in CRM systems. I actually had a conversation with someone from Salesforce a couple of days ago, Mike Brown, who used to be in the museum world. So this is, and he's part of the arts and culture on Salesforce. So they have very robust rules about how they're using it. So it is like, so if you're using something in the back end to do analysis on constituent data, they're definitely anonymizing it. It's definitely a secure connection, and they have a zero retention policy. And oftentimes that professional integration is not using is as part of that agreement. It's not using the information to calibrate it. So I think there is some scary things using it and some concerns about using the free model. But I think as it increasingly comes into the systems that we use, you should be aware, you know, reading the terms and conditions, but you should be aware about what's going on in the back end. And largely, it's about the protection of your data. And I think so. One simple example that they mentioned to me was using AI to generate, you know, a slew of letters to members or donors. You know, they're passing that kind of first name tag to the AI engine, but they're not populating, they're not sending that name. That information is coming back, and then it's getting populated. So there are some things, some nuances there where I think, you know, having AI backend in a system is actually a good thing.
Cool. I just wanted to, with Neal and Nick have said everything that I've wanted to say. It does. The key takeaway here for me, no, that's good. The key takeaway here for me is just be aware. Like, it's not a reason not to use AI. It's just be aware that The world is larger than your conference room. The world is larger than your office. And where are things going for good and bad? And how do you think about that? I use this example because I like historical examples. If I go to my grandfather who was born in the 1800s, how scary is that? My grandfather's war records from World War One, there is detailed medical information in there that I, as his granddaughter, probably should not know. And, he would be horrified for me to know that I knew. But that results from an era that was more than 100 years ago, where you couldn't imagine the possibilities. So imagine the possibilities now that may not have yet come to pass and how data could be used. I know we have lots of other topics, and I know we want to move on, Alex. I could talk about this for hours, so I won't.
No, thank you, Catherine.
I just make just one comment from Bill, which I should have mentioned, is about locally run. So you don't have to use these models that are out there and available to everybody. You can implement, and I believe Salesforce has an option to run your own local model, so on premise or in your own private cloud. So that is another way, and we'll probably see much more of that. Tools to create your own models that address this issue of sharing your data.
Yeah.
The only one thing with creating the model is good, but also be cognizant of not constantly building data silos, right? So the one thing is when you do that, and that's what we still see a lot of is, running all of this, which is really good, but then there's no connection to the other systems of which, then that data can be used. So think about that when you're thinking about architecture or what you're doing, is wanting to make sure that you're still making it connecting and to be able to do something with it instead of everything in silos, because I think that's one of the things that's plagued cultural institutions in general is siloed systems all the times that aren't connected, that can't pass data between each other. And that's actually what's plagued things like collections management systems for years, in which you can't get your data out of it. You can't do anything. So you're forced to hand type it or create another CSV or something like that over and over and over again.
Right. Thank you, Neal. Now, building on privacy and security, Nick, can you open up our discussion? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how museums can align their AI implementations with existing policies for managing culturally significant, Indigenous, and sensitive collections.
I think this is where the real problem is, particularly when we talk about bias and representation, right? Because certainly these free models are trained on the internet, which we know is a batshit crazy world for the most part, right? And there is a lot of information out there, and oftentimes there is minimal representation of marginalized communities, and it is heavily biased, certainly to the West. And I think partly the more that we are introducing culturally sensitive opinions and thought pieces into that kind of uber mass, it's going to address that bias, right, and bring it back. And I would encourage not to, if you are thinking of not using AI because of this issue that it is biased, the more information goes into it will help with that. But I think it is problematic, and I think it goes back. There was a comment earlier, I forget who it was, about all this in automation is removing that kind of curatorial practice and that review from it. And there is a danger around if you are in areas where it is sensitive cultural communities. I think you have to be very aware that kind of evaluation and that critique of what's coming back from AI is at the forefront. I mean, I think that has to be the most significant challenge. But I do think, institutions that do have, culturally sensitive data, are probably fully aware of what the issues are. So again, this kind of literacy around, there was a comment about critical thinking around AI. And I think when we think about what does training for AI mean, it does mean think critically about, how you are interacting with it. We've seen the issues, certainly on the generative AI side. I have a test for you, for anybody actually, which is to get an AI generative image model to create an image of a full glass of wine. It is nearly impossible. If you are using images, if you are using generative AI to create images, it's very hard, and you have to repeatedly interrogate and prompt the generative images to come back with diverse representation, particularly in crowds and individuals. It really is. There is a very significant bias on representation of skin color, particularly in generative models. This is a huge topic. I mean, I think there are issues around, sensitive or sacred objects that, the institutions already have a handle on, right? They already understand what the issues are around there. I think community consent, if you have collections around there, we are in Balboa Park in San Diego, where the Museum of Us has done a significant amount of work on partnering with indigenous communities. They have very highly sensitive cultural materials, and they're certainly doing a lot in this world. And they actually, are not able to publish their collections online because of the sacredness and the cultural sensitivity of it. So I think I'll kind of pause there for other comments, but I think this is probably where there is most concern about using AI. And again, using it with strict guidelines, strict understanding, strict literacy, critical thinking training, all those kinds of things are kind of the absolute musts.
Thanks, Nick. Before we open it up for Neal and Catherine to chime in, there was a question from Sarah. She wants to know what the prompt was that you used.
For the glass of wine?
I believe so, yeah.
So ask any generative engine to create a picture of a full glass of wine. It will, I mean, maybe it's getting information what a standard pour is for a glass of wine, but I have not been able to get it to, here is a full glass of wine, the kind of glass that my wife might drink.
I love the fact of is the relationship to what a standard pour is, right? 3 ounces, 5 ounces,
Right.
8 ounces, the
Right.
bottle, right? Depending on what it is. I love that.
It's really difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
Back and forth, it just refuses.
Oh, someone
Yeah.
said Grok can do it.
Oh, there you
Oh.
go. Well, it
Thank you,
depends on how
Elizabeth.
you interpret again what a full glass of wine is.
Right.
That could be interesting. Yeah.
Elizabeth is French, she knows.
Yeah. So the French pour might be bigger than the American pour.
Yeah. That's funny. With it.
Yeah. So Neal, Catherine, is there anything that you'd like to, share on this topic?
I think the thing I want to, comment on is it's tempting to rail on AI. Everything that we've talked about here is all about awareness. So awareness, but balanced awareness. So, not everything is bad, not everything is, but be aware that we often work from an assumption that AI is bad and that we are perfect. Not perfect, that's the wrong word. We are good, right? That we don't have bias. Our collections have biases, as just because they come from a certain era or because they come from a certain, whatever perspective, we have inherent bias. AI will magnify that, and we have to look at ways to counteract that. And some of that, when we get to the next section, some of that is about sharing more of our data to help counteract that. So that's just my 2 cents worth here.
Yeah, I think that was the thing I was going to do, and I know we're going to talk about that next. But it's one of those things about how can we contribute to help the bias or to help it learn more about cultural sensitivity, because these first models have just been about the internet and what's widely available. And let's be fair, the internet is not culturally sensitive, nor is it respectful of a lot of these kind of cultural activities, because a lot of it's not published about that for it. I think it also goes back to being able to make sure that the AI that you're using, where's the data going? So if you do have culturally sensitive information, making sure that it's not going off to other people or it can't be used, but instead be used by yourself to help generate ideas or understanding, that is more in line to what you're trying to achieve. So it comes back to, again, policy, where's your data going? And I think also the outcome. So if you're thinking about AI implementations for managing culturally significant things, we're working on one that will be available to announce in the near future, but it's about using AI to help recover lost languages. And within that lost language, there's actually culturally sensitive information to the indigenous and tribal community that we're working with, because some of the information that we're using to learn could be some of their special ceremonies or activities that they're doing that they don't want everybody to know about. And instead, then how is it using it under kind of a gated transaction where only those who are part of the tribal community, that community or that membership have access to parts of it. And so how do we then start to think about it that way? So being aware of where you're going with it. I'll use another example of a natural history museum where they have autopsy reports. So autopsy reports have a lot of sensitivity, as you can imagine, but they're so important to the medical community, so that anonymization of certain pieces of data, and then being allowed to use that and being aware of who has access to be able to use that data that's gone into the model, and then therefore what comes out of it is what we need to be thinking about. So who has access to what data are we going in, and who ultimately are we giving access to, and what's the ultimate outcome that we're trying to get by doing something with AI, with an AI implementation about that specific data.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you, Neal.
Let's-
For the sake of time, and because I know we are getting some great questions, we're going to move on to our last poll of the day today. So I'm going to go ahead and give everybody a minute to respond, and then we'll share those results. And again, if none of these responses apply, please, contribute your response to the chat.
Are we doing our bets again?
This is multiple choice.
This is multiple choice. So I think everyone's just going to check.
All bets are off.
Right.
All of them.
Or maybe not explicitly focused on this role yet.
Yeah.
I know, just while I was having, you talked about examples, Neal. I know Smithsonian are working on a project around metadata for culturally sensitive collections.
Well, I think it's probably something, depending on, I mean, I would assume that most organizations may have something that can be considered culturally sensitive, depending on what the subject matter is, obviously, of the institution. But it's always things to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
There's a lot to think about just generally, as we've just demonstrated.
Right.
Yeah. I think it goes to like policy, right? As well. If we just circle back to that, it's what are you ultimately trying to do with the AI?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and it could just be experiment, and that's fine. And you should do that, right? If I just give it 1,000 records from my collection and I anonymize it, so we're not giving that data, even though it's going into one of these, what does it do with it? What can we learn from it? Can it start to generate, some of these things? Can it help us find connections with this data? And, we have a client that has over 1 million documents. I think I mentioned this last week, and trying to be able to catalog and figure out what all of those are would take an army of people to do in a lifetime. And so, can we use AI to help at least suggest? And I think, Catherine, I'm not sure if it was you that said it, but either way, I'll give you the head nod instead of Nick. And then AI will correct me on it, which is, then how do we make sure that our systems, or if we're putting this out to public, we say this was generated by AI and either checked by a human or not checked by a human? And so how can we do things like that? Because we recognize we can't always do everything at once. So can we at least put this, some of the information out, or can we at least indicate where it was created by a human versus just created by AI? And then the third one is created by AI and checked by the human, I think is the next kind of thing that will go with this.
All right, so we've got about 95 responses. I'm going to go ahead and share our poll results. All right, so for the most part, it looks like by collaborating with communities to represent diverse perspectives is leading, followed by presenting objective research-based facts and interpretations, and then by amplifying underrepresented voices and lived experiences alongside historical narratives.
This is great. I love this.
Yeah.
I'm pleased to see that.
Yeah, please, if you have any other, responses, add those to the chat too, because this is fantastic. Thank you everyone for contributing to this poll.
I'm going to be really quick here, Alex. Sorry, I should let you introduce it first. Sorry.
No, please feel free to jump in, Catherine, because we are limited on time. So
I know we're limited on time, and I know we have tons of questions we want to try and get to.
Yep.
I'll just say that when we were planning this series, we realized that it could have been a year-long series, right? So we're trying to cover a lot of content really quickly. I just want to make a comment here about the fact that we live in a world of misinformation. And I don't need to say any more on that. I think everyone understands that that's the case. This is an opportunity for museums to take, who are very focused on integrity of data, who are very focused on integrity of information, to balance some of that misinformation by being one of the last resort, organizations that we can consider as for truth and factual data, and also to, as we've talked about in previous sections, to counterbalance the data that is out there, because AI has no brain. As a doctor said to me recently about antibiotics, has no brain. It can't distinguish good from bad. It can only just report what it has, deal with what it has. So the same thing, I think an opportunity for museums to think about how they can help to counterbalance that. And it's great to see in the poll that that's already a significant discussion. So I'm really thrilled to hear that. I'll let us move on to questions, Alex, unless we want to delve deeper here, just because I know that we only have 8 minutes left.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
I'll add a quick one, right? It's again about, I think it's going to be, there's a concept around fake news, right?
Yeah.
Which is fake news can be generated so much faster than real news. And so there's groups out there that are talking about how do we embed inside of the signals from real news locations that these are real news, or at least you're aware of the authenticated source. Because with deep fakes, it's really easy to create a CNN background. Me as one of the CNN guys is a deep fake, and then I say whatever I want, right? Quite honestly, it's really easy today. We can do this on our phone. And so I think that's one of the things that's going to come up is, how do we have content authenticity? And you're starting to see this really become a thinking point in terms of content that's made in the media and entertainment space. And I think it's going to end up, and in the news space, I think it's something actually museums could also start to look at, which is how do we actually embed content authenticity inside of an image so that it's very clear and can be read as this is an authentic image from XYZ museum or from other museums. And I'm not just talking about in the XF data at all. I'm talking about almost like a watermarking that goes even deeper into this for that authenticity.
Thank you, Neal. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our Q&A since we've got about 6 minutes left. This is from Sandra regarding free large language model tools, for example, ChatGPT, and paid for example, Claude. Is there a difference in terms of what you mentioned relating to biases, accuracy, etc.?
I'll jump in on this. The only way to know is to actually investigate and to start to read up on where is the data that they're getting from, right? And that's the only way that you can start to understand it. If the bias of, let's say, an image generating tool is just from stock photos, the likelihood it's going to be biased is really high because most stock photos have always been predominantly of white people, at least in North America. And so that's why it's about where does the data come from that you have to look at in order to understand what bias is or the accuracy level that it may end up with. That's why ChatGPT is still a little bit out there, because it still has so much data on it, in my opinion. Nick or Catherine?
No, I think they're all the same, but I think to echo your point, it's about where they're getting data. And so, it's that old adage, garbage in, garbage out, if you've got different garbage going into different models, you're going to get different results. Or different truths going into different models, you're going to get different truths. So just be aware. I think the challenge here is it's hard to find out. Like it takes, it's like reading terms and conditions. It takes a lot of effort to actually understand that. So I hope that in due course, we'll see more things about transparency around some of these models.
And that has to be part of the evolution process, right? Again, this technology is evolving all the time, and the institutions, the organizations that are providing this want to make sure it's more broadly adopted, right? It's a race to lead the adoption of this. So they are going to respond to what the biggest concerns are. Otherwise, people will vote with their feet. and use the models that are more closely aligned with what their kind of expectations and needs are.
Hey, Alex, can we go with Robin's question? I think it's really
I was
good.
actually
Yeah.
just going to say that one. So
Yeah.
thank you. I'm glad you pointed it out. So Robin in the chat put, we have concerns about using our collections data with free AI models, for example, ChatGPT and Gemini, due to biases, copyright, etc. However, as we are a regional museum, we simply don't have the budget to develop any models locally. I feel like that will probably be the case all over. How do you approach how do you approach Gen AI safely on a budget?
So
I hate to
Jen,
say this, but my view is wait. Wait. You don't have to jump on that bandwagon now. Others may disagree with me. That's just my opinion. The technology will get cheaper and more accessible and easier to use. Right now, it's too early to try and do those kinds of things, but it will come. That's my opinion. Others may agree.
Yeah, so I'm going to just change it a little bit, which is, if you're talking about your collections data, and depending on what you're trying to do with it, if, for example, you're trying to get it to help you create, alternative labels, or describe the objects in a different way, I would say that should be something that you should be thinking about with your collections management system. And then where does it get its data, or where is it's using your AI is probably the fastest way you can get there, compared to pulling it out and take it out and put it somewhere else all the time. And I think that's the one thing that smaller museums are going to be doing, because then it's about also, are you aware of where your collection system is then storing that data, or how they're connecting and doing the heavy lifting of connecting into these AI models, and what models are they connecting into, as a way to do it. And that's also a cheaper way, I think, is then for you to experiment, like you said, Catherine. So you're not trying to spin up a whole bunch of GPUs to do something, right? Where you need a bunch of people who know how to do certain things to get a model going, compared to working with some of your current providers of technology. Nick?
I have a third opinion. I mean, so Robin, if your collection is on the web and available, then it's probably already in there anyway. So, for me, I wouldn't have that concern, and you can probably check that with some querying and some prompting. I mean, that still doesn't mean you should, be releasing all your collections, what's in your backend CMS, particularly if there's donor and other private information in there. But I think, partly this is the challenge, is that it's all trained on stuff that's already out there and available. So it may be moot.
It comes down to that same thing over and over again, which is being aware of what you're trying to do with it. So the
Right.
answer to all of these questions is always has to start with, what are you trying to accomplish, or what are you trying to learn? And then from there, you can start to think about, okay, well, what data would I use to contribute to that in order to learn from it? And then therefore, what system could I use, and how are they going to use my data when I contribute to it? I think, that's kind of a framework, if you will, when you think about approaching AI projects, that you may need to think about, and how you're using it, regardless of whatever you're doing. Boy, that hour goes by quick.
I know. Unfortunately, we
Yeah.
are out of time. I apologize to those who we were not able to get to their questions. Thank you to everyone for those thoughtful questions submitted throughout the session today. Thank you to our speakers, and of course, the attendees for engaging in the discussion in the chat. A recording of this webinar will be available on Terentia's website, as well as our YouTube channel. Don't forget, our last webinar in the series is next week, January 29th. We will be looking outside of the arts and sector. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on Terentia webinars. Thank you all, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.